appreciate it.
My pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start with the renegotiated NAFTA deal between, of course, the US, Canada, and Mexico. There's a fear now that it may not get ratified because the Democrats control the House of Representatives. So what then?
Well, listen, every country has its own ratification process, and we're not going to meddle in the other countries' processes. But there's no question that this agreement has been very good for Canada, for the United States, and for Mexico. To have this stability, have this predictability. The U.S. exports more goods to Canada every year than they do to China, to Japan, and to the U.K. combined. We are their #1 export market for most of their states, and I'm very confident that the benefit to workers, to businesses, are going to carry the day.
All right. It was really tough to actually achieve that agreement when it finally did happen, of course, and that process was incredibly difficult, wouldn't you agree? So what happens in the interim while we're waiting for
many
the House
trade
of Representatives
deals take years to negotiate. This one we did in 13 months. There is certainly an intensity, there was an intensity to the process. But one of the things throughout we heard from were governors, members of Congress, business leaders in the United States, just saying how important it was that they have this secured relationship with Canada. So we remain very confident, but there's always steps to go through.
Now, I understand there's a clause in the agreement, however, that suggests that any of the countries within the USMCA, if they were to sign a free trade agreement with a non-market economy, that the deal is off to some extent. And many people think this non-market economy is actually referring to China. We know Canada is negotiating a free trade agreement with China, so what happens then?
Actually, there's been a lot of discussion around that particular clause. The fact is, both the original NAFTA and this USMCA have a 6-month exit trigger clause that doesn't even require you to give a reason. If any of the partners wants to walk away from the deal at 6 months' notice, they can for whatever reason. So the fact that we've suggested that trade deals with other countries could be one of those reasons actually changes nothing in the substance of the deal, and we're going to continue to look for opportunities to grow our trade footprint around the world. I mean, we've been incredibly successful over these past 3 years. We're now the only G7 country with a free trade deal with every other G7 country. And that's a significant achievement, particularly at a time where the doubts people have around trade in sort of political circles are creating a lot of fear and uncertainty. Canada is moving forward because we know that trade is good, and we know we can create benefits for all citizens through trade.
Right, that multilateralism is something I'll return to later, but how will that impact your ability to get a free trade agreement with China, with ASEAN, for instance? Is that something Canada's still pushing forward?
We continue. I just had a great meeting with some of the ASEAN leaders, and we're moving forward on exploratory talks on a free trade deal with ASEAN. We're also moving forward on a free trade deal, two free trade deals with South America, the Pacific Alliance on the west coast of South America, Mercosur on the east coast of South America. We're continuing to engage in trade all around the world.
Okay. Now, I'm sure you've seen the headlines in the last day. Britain's government has backed the draft Brexit agreement, and there's been some suggestion that the UK could pursue a Canada-style model of trade with the EU, and this is, of course, in reference to the broad-ranging agreement you have with the EU. So would that be something that would work for the UK? What kind of advice would you give them?
Well, listen, Canada is a great friend of the UK. We're a great friend of the European Union. We're happy to have a comprehensive free trade deal that right now includes both the European Union and the UK. After a Brexit, however that looks, we've already got agreements in place to ensure that the deal with the European Union continues to exist as a UK-Canada deal. Those details are really for them to work out, but we just want to ensure continued smooth transitions both for Europe and for the UK in terms of trade with Canada.
But in terms of your broad-ranging deal with Europe, what kind of advice would you give the UK, for instance, if they wanted to pursue something similar, something within the Canada model?
Our approach is that lowering tariffs, creating opportunities for businesses, for workers, is good for everyone, and therefore I encourage people to embrace free trade, embrace trade ties that bring people closer. My mandate from Canadians is really to diversify and strengthen trade with the world, and that's what we're doing, and I highly recommend it for all sorts of countries, because our country's doing well and our trade is doing very well.
All right. Now, just a few days ago, you confirmed that Canadian intelligence officials have heard the audio recording of the alleged murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Can you tell us more about that?
No, I can't.
Okay.
Obviously,
have you had a chance to listen to it?
No, I've been fully briefed by our intelligence officials, but we are engaged, as are most of our allies, in this investigation. This is something we take very seriously. An attack on the media, a murder of a journalist is something that is absolutely unacceptable in our modern societies, and we need to make sure that we're getting the right answers from Saudi Arabia.
Was it described to you? Did you hear it yourself?
I'm not going to go into details on sensitive information.
All right. Do you believe, as the Turkish authorities have suggested, that it was carried out with the highest approvals of the Saudi government?
That's exactly the question that we are working very carefully with our allies to answer, and obviously Saudi Arabia has certain answers to give, and we will make sure that we're getting those answers.
Would that impact Canada's relationship with Saudi Arabia? You've got military deals with them.
As you know, Canada and Saudi have had strained relations over the past months, because we came out very strongly against the arrest of the women's rights activists that happened in August, and the Saudis responded very strongly against Canada's continued and unequivocal standing up for human rights, which we will always continue to do. We inherited, yes, an arms deal for armored vehicles with Saudi Arabia that we are now reviewing the export permits related to, not just because of Khashoggi, because of the entire context, but this is something that we're continuing to engage with.
So you're saying that you could pull out of those arms deals if
we
necessary?
are looking at a number of different options, and we're reviewing those export permits.
Right. Now, you've also said that Canada would offer asylum to a Pakistani woman who has been acquitted of blasphemy in Pakistan. She's been freed from death row as well. So is Canada ready to offer her asylum, Asha Bibi?
Obviously, freedom of religion and protection of human rights is fundamental for Canada. We are very aware that this is an ongoing situation, and other than being saying that I'm a strong, welcoming advocate of supporting human rights, I'm again not going to go into too many details, because this is really an ongoing situation that is not something I want to influence one way or another.
Right. You say it's an ongoing situation, though. So what's the hold-up?
The domestic situation in Pakistan, which we are engaging with allies and partners on trying to provide solutions in what is something that is of concern.
And I guess that's to guarantee her and her family's safety.
The safety of her and her family, wherever they might be or wherever they might go, is tantamount.
And finally, I alluded to this earlier, obviously there's a debate raging at the moment between multilateralism and free trade versus nationalistic populism. We know the latter is rising around the world. Just look at countries like Brazil and Austria, for instance. You very much represent the former, so who's winning?
I think we have to recognize that citizens are anxious about the pace of change, anxious about transformation in our economies, anxious around the new waves of immigrants and of migrations around the world, and anxious about their place in their future and their kids' place in the future. And there are two choices in politics. You can either amplify those fears with the politics of populism and division, or you can try and allay those fears with concrete, sometimes complex, reasonable solutions. I'm very much obviously in the latter camp, and I think that there is no question that no matter what citizens you talk to around the world, of which country, obviously Canada is an example of this, but not the only one, if you actually come to people with a thoughtful, reasonable, positive vision, they will respond, and that comes from my deep faith in human nature and my understanding that if you give people an opportunity to rise to meet the challenges, they always will.
All right. Now, looking at Canada itself, we know that the Liberals won by the biggest seat margin ever in 2015. But if an election were to be held tomorrow, the latest polls show that you might lose, or your government might be handed a minority victory, so a coalition victory. So what do you have to say to that stunning fall from grace over the time in 2015 when you guys did so well?
If there's one thing we've seen over the past years in global politics is that campaigns really matter. We're almost 12 months away from the next election. There's an awful lot of work to do. I'm going to continue to stay focusing on Canadians, but we got elected on a promise to invest in the middle class, to support people in the middle class and those working hard to join it, and we've done just that. We've delivered on Canada Child benefits that have made a huge difference in lifting people out of poverty and giving opportunities and reassurance to people. We've been investing in infrastructure. We've been closing trade deals around the world. We have the lowest unemployment in 40 years, one of the fastest growing economies in the G7 last year, and our debt to GDP ratio is the lowest around. We are doing very well, but there's always more to do, and we've focused on making sure that Canadians have a positive vision that they're going to be able to vote for in 12 months, and I'm very much looking forward to that.